All right, so welcome. Obviously, we're here to tell you a little bit about what's coming up, which is our La Mesa History Center's 18th annual home tour. They haven't been consecutive because we had a few things in between, but our 18th annual, which started back in 2006 with our good friend and past president, a long time ago, President Gordon Jones, who decided after going to one of my college area home tours that he thought maybe that La Mesa could do this and do it better. And then he recruited me as soon as I moved over there. But wonderful to get that going. And of course, all of our volunteer staff, we're all volunteer organization. Some of us are professional historian and planner with state parks. Veronica, our president, is a professional archivist, and our talented and very, very active board members. And of course, all our volunteers and docents. And I know we have some of our docents who are going to help us pull off this tour. We can't do it without you. Very key. And of course, the folks who we certainly can't do that and are the real heroes of our home tours, and that's our homeowners who have the bravery, and we'll leave it with bravery, you can decide other, to allow 400 to 600 people wander through their house one Saturday to just check it out and see how wonderful it is. And of course, we're going to give you a little briefing on all the houses on the tour, and especially the last one, which Keith's going to give you a really in-depth understanding of the master architect, Sim Bruce Richards. This is the first time we've had Sim Bruce Richards' house on our La Mesa tour. I did have a sorority house on one of the college area tours one time that he and Jim Hubble did work on. And this house is another amazing piece of architecture and artisanship that you're going to see. And just give you a little more background on sort of the architectural heritage of the Grossmont and Mt Helix area, which is our focus neighborhoods again this year. We're very excited to be back here once again. And we're pushing the numbers, and it just worked out. And it's always sort of the way it just happens. This happens to be all the houses are mid-century houses this year, which are the folks in La Jolla know because they've just sold out their tour, which is next weekend, which is also mid-century. So the mid-century folks, this is your year for sure to catch up and see some amazing architecture, design, decor, etc., which we're going to feature on this tour as well. All right, so let's see here. And of course, we must thank our platinum sponsors and all the sponsors that help us defray the cost so that this is the #1 fundraiser for the History Center. A lot of folks, come to us to our archives. We're open every Saturday from 1 to 4. The House Museum's open, but also the archives. A lot of folks coming asking us to help research the history of your house, whether that's for landmark nomination or just because you want to know who the heck built this and who the heck lived here and all those fun things, which every house has a history. And we love sharing that with everybody. So we thank all of our sponsors. These are our key platinum sponsors that are helping us defray costs and make this a very successful event. All right, so just happened, we always try to pick something semi-witty as a title, and Grossmont and Mt Helix was the peaks of preservation. And I think you'll find that we have some amazing architectural heritage here that some people know a little about and some maybe not. And when we ended up looking into these 5 houses, we found that there's a lot of interesting interconnections between contractors, designers, clients, and family members amongst all those. So I think you're going to find this very interesting. And of course, a lot of fun heritage that goes here. So our general, and it just works out this year again, we're going to have Grossmont High School as our shuttle stop. That's where all of the tour guests and folks will pick up the shuttles. The shuttles run continuously for the 6 hours, and we cannot allow anybody to drive to these houses. And all. If you see the streets and the driveways, you know why. There's just no way we could get this many people to see it without that. And so that's our main reason. And what you'll see why we protect, a couple of reasons why we protect the anonymity of the houses and their locations is we want people trying to shift the rules and hop around. And in this case, they're too far apart to walk anyway between. But in this case, that's the main reason. They say, why don't you tell us where to go? Well, and it's also a privacy issue for our generous owners. One of my first turns I learned back about 20 years ago when we advertised the addresses and people would knock on the door ahead of the tour saying, well, I'm not going to be here on Saturday. Can I look at your house? And we felt that really wasn't kind of fair to our homeowners, as well as trying to skip the ticket. But anyway, which is a fundraiser, right? So anyway, but we know that it takes one, right? But anyway, and obviously, this area, I'm just going to be focusing mostly on the mid-century architectural heritage. There's obviously thousands of years of cultural history here with the Kumeyaay, the establishment of the Spanish colonial mission, the impact to the natives on that, native population, the change to the landscape, et cetera, et cetera. I won't talk about it other than know that it's sort of an interesting story, and that, of course, after the missions were desecularized, you then began to see the Rancho era, right? And interesting enough, parts of Mount Helix into Spring Valley ended up, once those ranchos had to be confirmed in the American period, ended up not in any rancho. Not in the Mission Rancho, not in El Cajon, not in Hamishaw. And it was what I like to call the land in between. And that's why early on in the 1850s, 60s, some of the 70s, the first communities that were established were in those areas because there was no title concerns. And so Spring Valley ended up being one of the first places to see settlement during that period. And of course, how could I not miss the wonderful, how did Mount Helix get its name? And I dug into this, as other historians have, and confirmed that, in fact, it's connected to a visit by a noted naturalist named Louis Agassiz. He was a Swiss known naturalist who came to the US. He taught at Harvard along with a guy named Josiah Whitney. You may have heard of this little mountain. Josiah Whitney had come to California to run the California Geological Survey in the 1860s and invited his friend out. And Agassiz came down to San Diego County. One of the few pioneer folks around was Mr. Porter. Porter said, let's go up to the top of the hill there. And Agassiz reportedly was shocked to find that the common European garden snail had made it out here with all the stock and was just taken over, as an invasive species do on occasion. I work for state parks, I can explain that to you more. But and so when the surveyors came a few years later to government surveys, said, what do we name that peak there? And he said, oh, that's the Mount Helix. And it's also a spiral, which makes a nice connection. But we do have that to the snail. And of course, if you've ever been to the city's Legacy Park, you will see Felix the Helix there to remind everybody about that. Right. And really things get going in the 1880s when the railroads finally permanently get to San Diego County. This triggers a real estate boom that was going on throughout Southern California at the time, and triggered mainly a lot by the citrus industry that was blossoming in Los Angeles, Riverside counties, and we had a small piece in that. And so you begin to see then improvements. What do you need to have suburban and agricultural development? You need water, right? As well as railroads to transport stuff. So one of the first things was the Sweetwater Dam, and the areas around there then getting subdivided into lots. And this is where some of the names, there was a Helix post office there, a subdivision, Spring Valley, it's called the Helix subdivision, La Presa, San Miguel, those all areas, those names sort of come up at that time as paper subdivisions. And if we look at that, and the star there is about where Grossmont High School is today, so you know where you check in, right? But just giving you an idea. And another thing that came up in the boom was the San Diego Flume Company. And these were the guys who've realized that if they could get more, rained a lot more in the Cuyamaca Mountains than it did down here. So if you get that water down here, you'd be set up. So they created a diversion dam where Boulder Creek meets the San Diego River, which is sort of the north end of El Capitan Reservoir today. And then through miles of flumes and tunnels, we're able to bring the water around the El Cajon Valley, across the pass right here, which at that time was known as the Alta Pass, and deposit it right here where we're standing in what's called the Eucalyptus Reservoir, which is basically, we're at the edge of it right here. And the whole Briarcrest Park is where the Eucalyptus Reservoir was. And that was the end of the flume line, to which then a ditch went south into Lemon Grove and Spring Valley, and another one cut across the Mesa to go what was called the La Mesa Dam, which is now Lake Murray, which I'll mention in a bit. So, right. So this was it. Hey, the water was great. And they completed this and opened it in February 1889, just in time for the boom to bust. So all those paper start to go in trouble, right? But in the meantime, the Flume Company also bought 4,000 acres from a guy named Harbison and subdivided it mostly into 5 and 10 acre lots, assuming to be citrus farmers that would come and buy water from them as a Flume Company. And then they were going to put the town site of La Mesa just to the south of that reservoir, which would be today at the center of 70th and El Cajon Boulevard in the college area. That's where the town of La Mesa was going to be. That's where the La Mesa School would be established in 1891, the first La Mesa Church, because down here where the downtown of La Mesa, today's La Mesa was known as Allison Springs, because that land from roughly University Avenue South all the way into Lemon Grove was owned by Robert Allison Street and all that, right? And it was known as Allison Springs. And he was a stock man as well. Right? And so at about the same time, what else do you need? You need transportation. And in April of 1889, the San Diego Cuyamaca Eastern Railway was completed. It's basically the route today that the trolley follows, right? They went a little farther than the trolley. The trolley now stops Santee. It went all the way out past Lakeside across the river to a place called Foster. But this was the first. So now you had the water, right? You had the transportation. Things were going to really happen. But of course, as I said, this is right at the time that the boom busts. And so it really doesn't turn into a big operation, though it begins to see settlers moving into the area. And the area just where we are and up and above here that we know now as Fletcher Hills was started out as the El Cajon Heights subdivision, owned by 2 guys, a guy named Johnson and a guy named Marshall. And if you've ever been to El Cajon, there's some streets named Johnson and Marshall, right? And this was it. And so you also see some of the other street names that have stuck over the years. It's been re-subdivided several times, but you can see some of those landmarks, and the star is where the high school will be eventually. All right. And so what's coming out of that? Well, Marshall had his own ranch, the Via Caro ranch there, which is sort of you can see on the map there. And then another guy named Herbie Park, who was at the time heir to the Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company, ended up buying much of the area up and renamed it the Alta Ranch, the past there, and built a nice little house and an even nicer barn. The nicer looking place is actually the barn here on the bottom. And then there was a spring there. And so they built a little dam and connected that up and created their own little private reservoir there to support their operations. And that's the one, if you're sitting at Anthony's today and you look out, that's that pond. And it was never connected to the flume. It was its own private source because it was just all the granite and everything. It just had a nice flowing spring, and the pond still operates today, though the rest of it's gone. But to give you an idea, and there's another shot of Eucalyptus Reservoir, which would be on the far left end of it there. So by the turn of last century, the previous century, excuse me, you're sort of seeing this sort of rural agricultural community around a few center points at the train stations and a few businesses and operations like the town site had a little school, a little one-room school. The school actually down in La Mesa Springs was called the Allison School from its origins as well. And so, and then 1895, the developers around the depot there subdivided and renamed it from Allison Springs to La Mesa Springs, which will cause some name confusion with our friends in La Mesa a bit. So if we want to talk about suburban residential development, it really starts up in the first decade when, especially as the automobile came in, you see the development around the sort of core areas. And, by 1912, the area around La Mesa had about 700 residents, El Cajon about 650. And per a new state law, if you had 600 residents, you could vote to incorporate. And that's just what both of them did in 1912. And so then you begin to see the subdivisions coming around that core area there in house lots, not in commercial lots versus acreage lots for agricultural use. And the same thing with El Cajon, just right there at Magnolia, Maine for a few blocks. That was the city of El Cajon early on. It's grown quite a bit since. And of course, with that, we begin to see some of the interesting architectural precedents that are going on at this time. And this is the progressive era, right? The idea of breaking the trusts and giving independence to local municipalities, and so that movement was going on and thinking towards the future in a way to separate themselves a little bit from the stuffy Victorian era and the folk Victorian, and beginning to look at architecture as more iconic and placemaking in a way that got all the way down, not just in castles and big buildings, but into residential work, right? And some operations. So even the Mission Revival style grammar school there, very clean lines. It's coming out of the Mission Revival emphasis in California and that really comes out of the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, when it was decided that the California building needed to look like a mission. And that's where the Mission Revival architecture gets going. It's popular for about 2 decades, and then it's going to eventually, after the exhibitions in the teens, move more toward Spanish colonial Mediterranean, those styles. But early on, that was a big thing that really represented California. And you can see the 1911 Congregational Church that's still there on 3rd. Very clean lines. Emmerich Weaver, who's known as a master of arts and crafts, does that building. So he's obviously being influenced by guys like Irving Gill. And we had 2 different Irving Gill properties that existed. They're both long gone, unfortunately. That was the Bank of La Mesa office and the La Mesa Heights, which is the name they changed. After City of La Mesa incorporated as La Mesa, not La Mesa Springs, they changed the name up there to La Mesa Heights, and what it did until the college area when the university moved out there. So it gives you an idea of sort of that. So there's certainly you're seeing some of those modern precedents. And I like to say the Mesa Heights Grammar School, a year before the Bishop School, has a little bit of similarities to it. Oh, and if you didn't know, if you're worried about missing Irving Gill's funeral, I think Mark's here, right? Right. You're going to be giving his services here soon, right?
2 o'clock on the 7th at Mount.
There we go. So if you didn't see the newspaper articles, long time, what had happened to Irving Gill's ashes? Well, they were found in a storage locker a few months ago, right, in Mount Hope. And so the Irving Gill Foundation is going to hold a proper memorial service for this groundbreaking architect here who made his mark here in San Diego. So you can check it out on the website. Anyway. And of course, we were seeing it also in the residential architecture in La Mesa as well. And you can see the Prairie Star influences the Mission. In fact, we had the Todd House on the tour again last year, if you got to see that. Congratulations. But you're beginning to see that it isn't just craftsman. Well, sure, we had plenty of craftsman bungalows and the things that were the generally popular homes, but we also had some of these sort of cutting edge elements in the architectural heritage here. All right, let's start to get into the area we're really focused on, and that's Grossmont. And it had a unique beginning. Ed Fletcher had come to San Diego from Massachusetts as a teenager, started working for different fruit merchants and businessmen, traveling about the county selling things, and realized, boy, if this county just had good roads and some water, we could do stuff. And he became then a major leader in the progressive movement here and in infrastructure, government to produce infrastructure to help business and private entities, right? So you were seeing that. And it just happened he was on vacation at Yellowstone National Park when he ran into a guy from New York named William Gross. Gross had made his money in theater in New York and was tired of sort of the rat race running around in New York and was looking for a way to someplace to go to invest and sort of semi-retire. And Fletcher said, hey, this Mr. Park just died. There's this property called the Alta Ranch in San Diego. And I just bought the other one ranch next to it. Let's do something here. And they partnered up. And of course, you see that headline down on the bottom there. That's from 1909 when they put the first road to the peak there. And luckily they thought better of their marketing and did not call it Mount Gross and called it Grossmont, which was the term that then they came up with, and then re-subdivided again into the subdivisions roughly that we see today, the three main subdivisions, the one around the core there to the peak, Grossmont Peak, and you can see that. To the west, where they were trying to convince the extremely popular author Owen Wister to come and invest, and he actually bought lots, started on a house, and was planning on moving out here, having a Western house when his wife passed away and he abandoned the project. But to allure him, of course, they named the streets, Molly Winters' character in the book, Virginian. If you don't know, The Virginian is the novel that is sort of the one that sets that sort of iconic, quiet man, cowboy iconic character into legitimate American literature. Before that was sort of dime novel stuff, shoot 'em ups, things. And this was the one to sort of get that quiet man who did the right thing for the school marm at the end of the show, right? And so that was one of the most popular novels as well of its period, and very iconically important. So that's the kind of folks, because with Gross's connection to the entertainment industry, the idea was to invite as many artists and craftspeople and performers and to be able to live in this, to create this arts and crafts bohemian colony out here in the land of no weather, San Diego, right, where you could year round have that opportunity. And we begin to see that in some of not a lot of houses built. So this is still pretty rural out here area, but you begin to see some of those same things. And the Grossmont Inn, I can see that's more classic weaver of arts and crafts detail, right? But you can see on the inside house, right? But also in the Lewis house, looking at sort of these proto-modern styles that were influenced by Gill and others. So then, of course, what else does Fletcher realize? He's really good. Fletcher is that venture capitalist who has the 10% of the money and finds the other person with the 90, right? And so he finds a guy from Montana named James Murray, a man who'd made his money in mining and selling lots of drinks to miners and things like that. Sounds a little like a guy named Hearst out here in California, and made quite a bit of money. And he gets Murray to come in, buy up what's now all that area, in that area, which then they renamed Murray Hill, which was now Fletcher Hills. And he also gets them to buy out the insolvent flume company. So why? There are a couple of reasons that things didn't go. And one of them, there was an extended drought from about 1897 to 1904. And in 1899, the flume company went upside down and was taken over by its creditors. It was out of business because they just couldn't produce the water to fill their contracts, and then couldn't pay off their bonds, right, for all the improvements and the maintenance of all that. Miles and miles of wooden flumes, that's a lot of maintenance. Anyway, so he gets them, and for $150,000, which is decent money in 1911, but not that much, they buy the entire water system and take it, realizing now we got water to work our land, right? So it was a very logical thing, and they put an additional reservoir in, which is now under Griffin Park. If you ever go there, it used to be open, and now it's in a tank underneath the park, so it's a park and a reservoir still. Of course, and there's the Lotus Pond, it's Anthony. So that's sort of area. And in 1912, influencing that, a briar track, and if you were here 2 years ago when we did our talk on the history of this area, and we're right next to the briar track here. It's not much of it's left. It's only about half of it, but this is the streets that have all the Native American names. That's why there's Wakarusa and Nokomis, right? That all goes back to Hiawatha and the poems and all that good stuff, right? And probably the most noted resident, because there wasn't really any houses built, but in the 20s, this really exciting little short-lived and pretty much failed film company called the SNL Grossmont Studios had a little operation right here. And it would have been roughly where Nokomis meets the current Murray Drive. This whole area we're at here has been completely removed. In fact, the whole neighborhood I'll talk about that used to sit right here is long gone because of all the freeway expansions over the last 30, 40 years. But what's fun is there's a little story, and if you want to look at this 1920 area, you can sort of see the landscape around us here, right? So that studio would be the highway. Murray Drive is way much north, cutting off almost the whole site up there, and the freeway's a little lower. But you can see now the Grossmont streets are sort of, they're all graded in, not a ton of houses. You've got some of the other street lines and things that you can recognize, and that's where the studio had been. And of course, the Grossmont High School was up by that point. And the site is chosen. Ed Fletcher, once again, gives the land to the school district. They were trying to figure out where to go. At that point, early on, before the cities were incorporated, they could hop kids onto the train and go down to San Diego High School. But once they were incorporated city, they were no longer paying into the same school fund. And so the San Diego High School said, time out. We'll let whoever's in there finish, but you can't send more kids because you're not paying into the district. So they knew out here in East County they needed a high school, and they were trying to figure out from Lakeside, El Cajon, La Mesa, Spring Valley, what's this more central location. And so they picked this site here that Fletcher gave them because it was along the railroad route. So that's one way to get to school, right? And along the highway. So if you were driving in, that was easy to get to and fairly central. And that's why the site was chosen. So you get this shot of, and there's the old reservoir. And you can just see how developed Fletcher Hills at that time. Not. And just so you know, not only are they going to be our stage stop, but they will have their museum open. Not this building, but it's in one of the rear buildings. This is the building we had. The old original building was on the tour 2 years ago. But they will have the museum open if you want to go check out a little foothiller history for the folks out there. Now, a little bit to the south. Who again? Ed Fletcher. Why do I keep bringing this name up? Huh? Ed Fletcher realizes that the higher peak to the south, Mount Helix, also has a lot of opportunity, right? And so he connects with J.P. McGlurkin, who owned a lot at that time of the eastern slide of Helix. In fact, Resmar for a while was going to be known as McGlurkin Boulevard, if you remember my lecture from that a few years back. They decided not to go with McGlurkin. It's not Resmar, but there's a long story there. As well as a guy named Fred White, who was a lumber dealer here in San Diego and who was married into the Yawkey family of Wisconsin. And the Yawkeys were timber folks. They had made their fortune on timbering lumber, and they had a lot more money than their cousins in Boston, even though their cousins did own the Red Sox. And that comes up a lot. Not those Yawkeys, the Yawkeys in Wisconsin, and they had a lot more money. But anyway, and so the story was then, of course, that if you are familiar with this little story, right? The Easter sunrise services actually began in La Mesa's Mount Nebos, possibly as early as 1912. And in 1917, when La Mesa decided not to hold one, the San Diego Advertising Company talked to Mr. Fletcher and said, hey, could we do something on your peak on Easter sunrise? And so in 1917, they did their first. And the next year, the La Mesa folks, and they agreed that Mount Helix was a bigger, larger location than Mount Nebo. And of course, it's been ever since. And the story was that White brought his mother-in-law out to have one of these. And at that time, they just basically would set up chairs and sort of stand a little altar for the priest, and they would just sort of sit on the rocks and listen to the service. And she thought, well, this is nice, but it's kind of uncomfortable. So, of course, the White Yawkeys came up with the money to build the theater that you see there, right? And we'll be celebrating its centennial next April. And it has been, other than a couple of reasons recently not to hold it, has held the Easter services every year since. And that interwar era, is also when you're beginning to really start to see more housing. And the sort of model early on in this interwar 20s, 30s era is this idea that Fred Hansen, who was a fascinating character, sort of Horatio Alger novel sort of character. I mean, a Danish immigrant who gets a job with the Cyclone Fence Company as a youngster, rises up to be a vice president just in time for them to be bought out by U.S. Steel and become one of the richest guys in Chicago in 1923, searches the world for where he wants to live his second life with his wife, and decides that this area around San Diego County and Mount Helix is the perfect place to do it. Once again, no weather, lots of opportunity, and he finds the perfect thing that he thinks is going to really trigger not just wonderful revival style houses, but this thing called the avocado, which the California Avocado Association had been working to breed ones that were tasty and all kinds of, you'll see all the street names over there, all named after varieties of avocados. That all comes from Fred Hansen and his Calavo Gardens subdivision, which hit in 1928. John Cornelius out of LA came down and then subdivided the area known as Casa de Oro, gold. They were saying green gold. That was the idea, the avocado estates. And unfortunately, Cornelius went bankrupt in 1931. Hansen survived on to a great career here in San Diego County, was a longtime county planning commissioner, helped develop the whole Sweetwater Springs area. All kinds of fascinating. I wrote a little biography on him that's on the foundation website. If you look at the Fred Hansen Foundation website, just a fascinating character who was involved until in development and support of the county areas until he passed in 1974. Just a fascinating story there. So that's sort of the model that you begin to see, this idea of the avocados, your revival style house surrounded by an acre or two of this wonderful, profitable thing that will grow on the side of hills with much less water than citrus and very little soil, etc. So sort of that was the push there, and really becomes the sort of iconic for and of course Fallbrook has continued on as the big avocado area these days in the county, but this is where it really got rolling in the county. And just if you look at this two sort of western views of the Grossmont Peak and Helix, you can just see, but in 10 years, how many houses are starting to come in. Most of them in these popular pre-World War II revival styles that were dominating the architectural landscape here. Mostly Mediterranean Spanish, though a few you will also see on occasion Tudor and some other sort of modern precedents and things. So there's Clement Shaw's work on the Carmichael House over in the west side of Mount Helix. It's also the era when the ranch house comes out, and a couple of key San Diegans who, they didn't invent it, but they certainly modified and promoted it massively. One is Lillian Rice, who we had one of her last houses she did was over here in Mount Helix. It's been on the tour before, and we hope to have it on some other time. But she was someone who came out, one of the first licensed female architects here in Southern California, and practiced with folks and helped motivate folks like, I'll talk about Lloyd Rocco and others over the years that she worked with, Richard Recwa and all. And of course, then there's the kid from Mission Hills, who after marrying into real estate offices, the Lichty family, who was developing Talmadge, and his father-in-law told him, you know, this being a trombone player in a band isn't going to cut it for you. You're going to be my daughter's husband. You need to find something to do. So he starts messing around with building mission-style furniture. And one of the clients who walks into the Talmadge real estate office says, "Hey, that's some nice furniture. Who that furniture?" And this is the story. And they said, "Oh, that's my son-in-law." And he said, "Great, have him design a house around it for me." Well, 18,000 houses later, with no architectural license, Cliff May is probably one of the most prolific architectural designers ever. And his influence on the post-war through his ranch house sizes, collaborations with Sunset Mag, get us started here. And of course, we had this house on the tour a couple of years ago. And it's just an amazing example of his early rancheria style homes that he did about 40 of them here in San Diego County before moving to LA, where the market was a little bigger and the clients were a little richer. That's blunt, but true. And so you began to see this. And so we had this house, and it just happens that this house also had a little interesting addition in 1965 by a guy named Lloyd Rocco. And so this is the same actual house, right? So how about the house with two master designers, huh? And our friends there are taking great care of it. It's on the county register, of course, now, and all those wonderful things, but it was on our tour a couple years ago to show you sort of the matchup. And so since I mentioned them, of course, if you were here 2 years ago, we did focus a lot on Lloyd and Ilsa Rocco, whose original house right after married was just one of those ones in this neighborhood here, Mesa Knolls, that got wiped out by the freeway expansions over the years. But they were great leaders, both in architecture and art here in the mid-century, and are often called out as the leaders of the modernist movement here in San Diego County. And if you want to see more about that, those lectures are all up on our YouTube site, my presentations, as well as presentation with Dave Hampton and Todd Pittman, who are two elite scholars of these topics. And of course, the influence is not just on architecture through Lloyd, but also Ilsa Rocco, Ilhan Rocco's work as the head of the art department at San Diego State. And if you'll know, as we mentioned, from Il Cavo and then later at their home in Alvarado Estates, they were, you know, leading the salon and directing and mentoring artists and architects at all kinds of levels here. And so just knowing that is, I want to bring that because we're going to start talking about some of these houses and how the connections between people who were part of the Rocco group, but also had family connections in and around all this that really makes it an interesting sort of dynamic that we're going to be featuring in this year's tour. So let's get to it. This is the meat of it here, right? What's happening here in the post-war? And of course, if you know that World War II was this, you know, seminal event for San Diego County in that the population doubled in the county in 4 years during the war boom. And that was the point where the Navy and department had put a lot of money in and said, "Hey, you guys are about to run out of water." you don't have enough water produced locally for this. It then forced the county to join the Metropolitan Water District with Los Angeles. In fact, Fred Hansen was part of that negotiating team. And we then got the big pipe, right? And once that happened, talk about exponential growth, right? Once that big pipe came in, right? So the estimate was, at the time, was that the county could hold about 400,000 people population with local sources. And what are we now? 3.6 million, something like that, right? We're kind of adapted to that big pipe. And so, but what it did is it allowed that many more people to come and have an opportunity to live here and to develop a lot of these communities. And of course, it was a very young community as well. This was the great beginning of the baby boom. Up into the 60s, it was one of the, I think it had the youngest average age of any metropolitan area in the country. It was one of those Sunbelt cities that was just moving forward, and they really were buying onto the sort of, whether they were true modernists or not, were buying to the look to the future, that we've won the war, we've defeated fascism, and here's our chance to get the dream lifestyle and spread it out for everybody, from folks who could afford an architect to the folks who are in entry-level tract houses, and how to get that. And I'll talk a little bit about how this fits in, right? And of course, the landscape around here is just reflective of this movement and how this area of the Greater La Mesa area took this all in. And of course, our host today, the Grossmont Hospital District, was one example. And when they hired Pereira and Luckman to do the original piece of the hospital, and if you look up on the left there, that's Luckman on the left, Pereira on the right, and in the middle is a guy named Marvin Jackson, who at the time was the original president of the hospital district and was working on not only PASA, the folks in the district voted 88% to tax themselves to create a hospital. When's that ever happening, right? And they knew they needed this, right? And Jackson just happened to be a developer with a company called Jackson Sky. You might know, we've heard that, I'll mention them on occasion. So he knew architecture and design, as you will find out. We had Stanley Scott's house on the tour a couple of years ago. And as you can see, that the design was to grow. And so this shot from the early 70s, which will include a Richard Wheeler addition as well to that hospital, is just sort of one of the first sort of pieces, right? So in this institutional landscape, we're seeing the modernism come in. And if you want to learn more, we do have the book on the hospital district, which I always tell the district I put for them, so that would it. Anyway, and of course, then other buildings, you know, we see in the Civic, there's really only one piece left to this, to the Civic Center, and that's the City Hall. George Hatch designed all the buildings at the time, but there's only one left now. Of course, the police station and the Chamber building, both by Bob Delorier, are long gone as well here recently, knocked down over the last decade or so. But you can just sort of see this move toward the modern and how this was affected. And of course, we see it also in our schools. Sam Hamill, who did about a dozen of the elementary schools and Helix High, folks like Clyde Huffbauer, Herlich Brindegard, and Bob Ferris. Brindegard's one of those guys who worked with Rocco, and Clyde did too, or even LA's Ron Young, who came in and did that for all the Norsemen out there, that interesting round high school. There's only other one like it is at Irvine. There's another one he did like that at Irvine. There's only two we know of with the round high school. But certainly modern. And of course, Welton Beckett's work at Grossmont Shopping Center. Beckett, possibly the most prolific mid-century architect in the country, did everything across the planet: hotels, shopping centers, cities, universities, name it. I mean, when we did the Grossmont, and the Grossmont Center lecture is also up on our YouTube page if you want to see that in depth. But just really, and not a whole lot of it left other than the facades of old Marston's. But it also gives you an idea of just how happening and growing this area was after the 50s and its exponential growth. In the 50s, cities, La Mesa triples its population, right, in 1 decade. It goes from 10 to 30,000 people in 1 decade. And Marston's, in trying to find their first mall site for their, they were the main department store, they chose here, right, just down the street, right, as a place that was central, had the freeway connections, and was growing exponentially both at all levels of the economy. So really was a key to it. And of course, Beckett's influence would also been known with a guy named Elmer Drew, who went to the 1964 World's Fair and saw Beckett's Ford building in the Rotunda, and came back and asked local designer Jim Hurley to design him a slightly smaller version of the Rotunda, which for years, of course, was the round house of values here at Drew Ford. Unfortunately, it was torn down a few years ago. We did get all the documentation, but certainly an icon that a lot of folks miss. And in commercial buildings, of course, the Anthony's La Mesa, you think about it, right? Or Bob Dorley's Top Shelf restaurant, which is now the Brigantine. Those were really cutting edge and really trying to push that in the commercial venue as well, looking at the styles. And speaking of churches, Dr. Mark's here as well. We had our share of modern churches as well in the area. This was a place we see a lot in the county of early, I'll say, pushing the edges architecture in the churches. There was a lot of opportunity to put some things here. And we had Mr. Church, architect Bob Delorier from La Mesa, who did some pretty amazing. His first one was St. Luke's over there on Wilson Street, but you all might recognize the Fletcher Hills Presbyterian, sort of an iconic thing that you've been down Fletcher Parkway, or the rather striking Carlton Hills Lutheran. And Bob practiced here in La Mesa for many years. We have his scrapbooks, his son donated to us. Just an amazing architect. But what we're talking about now is what we're really going to focus on is how it affected residential and how the examples and how the Grossmont and Helix Greater Mesa area was really key into being an iconic place for this. And of course, this post-war baby boom and nuclear family nirvana, right? And then you see there, that's actually a promo photo from the school district with the family and their 2.5. Oh, I'm sorry, the dog counts as one now. 3 kids. And of course, the idea of an outdoor swimming pool as well, right? So that whole post-war baby booming need of housing and people rushing to this wonderful place in Southern California where there's no weather and lots of great things to do, beaches, mountains, all that desert fun stuff. And certainly Mount Helix begins to be identified. And as we look at Grossmont and Mount Helix, and you'll see this on the tour course, lots of interesting rock outcroppings and great views. And the lots and the houses are going to take advantage of that all the time. And this sort of organic sort of modernism that people like Rocco and others were promoting at the time to make residential architecture functional and also create experience and aesthetic for folk homeowners, not just a place to dwell. And so what was that post-war community looking for? What were the house buyers looking for, right? They obviously wanted built-ins, and they wanted to have extra storage space, 2-car garages, enclanced larger kitchens, at minimum 2 bathrooms, which is a huge difference between pre-war. I spent 10 years in Rolando, and a lot of our pre-war houses were all 2-1s and 3-1s, and people could ask me, I said, because there wasn't this thing called television. And so after it is the den or family room, as we'll call it, the TV room, right? That really starts kicking in after our first television stations here in 1948 go on the air, and this thing becomes a need to have a room, not only to separate from the formal living room, but also a place to tuck the kids away, right? And so everything from, and at the same time, you'll see this, the idea of looking at new technological structural systems like post and beam and other things that are going to be moved into residential architecture at many different levels, as well as that need for the booming generation to have that family or TV room. So the things that are all sort of become trends and highlights of the post-war era are things that the builders are going to do to meet that demand, as well as, of course, other really high-tech stuff, right? High-fi stereo systems and cocktail bars, because, of course, how can you listen to your Mose Allison record if it isn't crisp? Because if it's not crisp, your martini just doesn't taste the same. And so you have to make sure you have these key things available into your houses and the demand. And it would be in tracks as well, from more entry-level tracks like Richard Wheeler did for the Severn Company up in Fletcher Hills, to their little higher-end Grossmont Hills tract, which is just to the east of us a little bit here down Murray Drive, where they were taking on houses, tract house models from Edward Fickett of Los Angeles, but also local custom builders like Mark Iselton and Homer Hess and others were buying up key lots within these tracts. And they did the same thing in East Ridge. There was a lot of the same companies over on the west side of La Mesa at the time to sort of, and you can see the marketing there, a little bit of Breakfast at Tiffany's kind of marketing right there. Yeah, sort of high-end, hip kind of thing going on because that's the way all housewives looked in 1958. Right. And of course, and by the late 50s, Helix was already recognized as a place that had these wonderful examples of really cutting edge, sort of fitting all these iconic ideals and these sort of pushing the function and the needs that the house buying public was looking for, and especially the professional level folks out here in Mount Helix and Grossmont, who a lot of these guys were marketing to with the new hospital and all kinds of new business and things to have that opportunity. Right. So who are we talking about? Practitioners out here the Rocco, and we've had a couple of his houses on the tours, but you get an idea of the kinds of housing that's out in the area from Lloyd, or Henry Hester, who got a couple of his early projects out here and would do some pretty impressive work, and we've had one of his houses on the tour, or Homer Delowy, the Gold Band's residence, was on our tour a few years ago. He's also someone who worked with Lloyd for several years. Tucker Sadler and Bennett, another very prolific, very well-known and popular firm, did a lot of interesting properties. And of course, we just lost John this last year, but John Mock, who did some pretty amazing stuff. And these houses were on our tour a few years back and are just amazing icons of the work and of his great breadth of work that he did over the years here in San Diego. But it isn't just architects, because there's a much bigger market than someone who can afford to hire an architect and do a custom home, but also a lot of master builders and designers. And here's just a list of a few we've had on the tour who are major practitioners here in the area. And I highlighted a couple of them because in this year's tour, you're going to get a chance to see an Eckel and a Mortensen. And so, but this is a very, very hot area for folks who were the master builders. So this time you didn't necessarily have to have a license. You just had to have somebody to check it for you when you put it in for the permit. And so we have some very talented folks who never got their degrees and therefore never got their licenses, but were really top-end builders and designers of homes. And our first house that we're going to talk about is one of those by the partnership of George Eckel and Leonard Smith. We'll talk about family stuff, right? So George and Leonard were brothers-in-law. Leonard had married Grace Eckel. They were all Kansas natives. And after the war, Leonard comes out and decides San Diego County is the place to start up. And he starts up a real estate business. He also does a little training with Lloyd in draftsing and things to get a little handle on it. And it just happens that his brother-in-laws, George and Wayne, come out and are contractors. And they start to work together. And we know that they were extremely positive. And you see there's the wives on the right there, the little group there, involved in the community, very community-minded. And we're very lucky that Leonard's son, David, donated all his listing files to us at the archives, which is a great source for us to be able to look in. And because Leonard probably knew everybody's house and who built it and when, and he was a fascinating guy. And I can't find anybody who ever says anything negative about Leonard. And when my wife and I moved to Mesa in 2004, guess who we bought from? We bought from the Leonard Smith thing. It was their listing, right? Just happened to be, right? So just a really fascinating story here, right? And of course, George did a lot of custom homes. We anticipate that they somewhere between 75 and 100. I mean, we actually had an intern sort of looking at the collection, figuring out how long it's going to take us to go through the whole thing. But we think it's somewhere between 75 and 100 at least custom houses, plus some bits of track work here and there. So really there, and we've had one of their houses on the tour, the Elmer and Violet Drew house that was on the tour a few years ago as well. So you really get to see these guys, and their focus really was on the modern ranch. They were known as, this was their specialty. And, the covered patios, the redwood, the brick, the open spaces, the details on all of the different features, the built-ins and all that. And what you're going to see in our house that's on the tour this year is probably one of the most authentic examples I've seen. I mean, I think I looked at maybe one piece of hardware that looked like it had been replaced. I mean, this is about as original, and there's been about 4 or 5 owners, and the current owners, they're Susan. Oh, three owners before you? Oh, you're 3. You're 3. Okay. So yeah, and not too many, which helps sometimes in keeping things together. But it is probably one of the most, as I said, authentic. And its second owner was a guy named Bob Castetter, who was a founding member of the Western School of Law. So a very prominent individual purchased the house, and it's just fantastic. A wonderful example. It also has another local connection that's kind of fun. It has a real Catalina pool. And for any of you know, Catalina Pools is probably one of the most popular and well-known companies from La Mesa in swimming pool development. And H. Vance Baker, who owned that company, was a major leader business-wise, as well as a city councilman for a couple of terms as well in La Mesa. Very connected. And that company, and you all remember probably the neon sign as you drove down 80/8 over the years, that finally came down when that building was taken out along with the John Mock building as well. But anyway, that's there, and part of the history, and you'll be able to see. All right, so now let's jump to the guy who's probably one of the most popular, most well-known of these custom builders in the area, and that's John Mortensen. And Mortensen is an interesting character. I actually worked early in my career with the gal who did her thesis on John. Roxy Phillips, who's long since passed, but a really wonderful lady who had a lot of interest in architecture and was looking for a thesis topic when she was at USD. And luckily, the professor said, "Hey, there's this builder who just retired. You should go interview him and do your thesis on him." His name's John Mortensen. And so that thesis I've known about for 30 years. And as we keep building on, as we find more and more Mortensens and document them and just look how wonderful his work was. He started out as literally a carpenter with the Jackson Scott firm, worked his way up to site superintendent. In 1958, created his own company and pretty much designed and built the majority of houses. Though he also built houses for other people. We found one he built for John Mock in Elhart and Verdi a little while ago, et cetera. So worked for a lot of folks and is very well known in that, right? And of course, it's sort of becoming a tradition now every time we come out here to Mount Helix to make sure we get ourselves one of a Mortensen on the tour. We've had several amazing ones over the years. In fact, his first sort of known, the Adams House, which was on the tour a few years back, and then of course the Yock House and the Hines House. So always good. And we've got another great one. And it's one that was built and was purchased by Dr. Wesley Herbert, who had been a long time Lemon Grove physician, was well known in the area, purchased this fairly expensive house and had a photograph of its wonderful double open fireplace in the newspaper back then. And there's a picture of it today, still pretty much following up, right? And Herbert was very well known. In fact, he was one of the first doctors on the Grossmont Hospital staff, for example. So they had lived there for quite a while. And it is a great example of John's work. Beautifully sited on the lot, great views, has sort of the custom, the board and bat sort of siding, the open sort of, rooms, like I said, the double glazed fireplace. And of course, one of his iconic features we see in a lot of his houses, the sunken tiled bathtub shower combo. And so just know that this house has been wonderful to go, couples, you guys are here now, but have done a wonderful job in giving it a nice sort of retro update. And so it really sort of matches up to all the details as well as has a more current feel. All right, so that's 2 down. We got a couple more to talk about here. And this one is an interesting one. Maybe in Mintz, perhaps are probably the largest and one of the most prolific general contractors to work in San Diego County in this period. Richard Dick Maybe and Theodore Ted Mintz were formed up their company in 1955, just about the right time. They would, work up into the 80s and take on amazing projects. I'm just going to put a few up there, but they were extremely well respected. They were known, and they worked with, I will say, just about everybody. This is just a very inkling, a small little tidbit of the kinds of projects they worked on that you might recognize with Bill Crissell and developer Len Drogan from the college area, Tucker Sadler Bennett, Deems Martin, Leonard Weitzer, right? And then the other list, I'm just listing, Samarowski, Don, Paderewski, Matthews, Wheeler, Young. I could find them working for just about anybody, as well as doing their own projects as well. But probably they're most well known for their work they did a lot of projects with Henry Hester. And in this case, possibly their most popular known project is what originally started as the Cecile Abbey, but is now known as the Solomon Apartments on 6th, which went through a wonderful renovation about 20 years ago, and is now an iconic mid-century project. And so Hester and Mintz worked on many projects. And on this one also they worked with somebody who we're going to hear about, and we're going to get into this connection stuff. Interior decorator Gerald Jerome. And I've talked about somebody who's just about as prolific as maybe in Mintz, it's Gerald Jerome, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But this is the kind of work. And so when I first ran into this house that's going to be on the tour, and trying to connect it to that, I was saying, well, how do I connect this stuff? Because I couldn't find any records of articles about who designed it, articles about who built it. There was very little. But I did then eventually find this little article that maybe Mintz had been hired early on in their career by a well-known businessman by the name of Isidore Teacher to build this apartment complex over in the Golden Hill, Grant Hill area. It's at Broadway and E Street there, Broadway and 28th in there. And it's still there, as you can see by poor photograph, but I got one. And this was one of the first projects that maybe Mintz did. And this was a fairly prominent individual, right? So who is Isidore Teacher? Well, Isidore Teacher is a fascinating story. He's a Lithuanian Jewish immigrant, ended up in Chicago where he got into business. In 1923, he moved to San Diego and began to invest in property and open a jewelry and a pawn shop business amongst other businesses such as after Prohibition and taverns and other interesting businesses, right? Was a very prominent member of the Jewish community, a founding member of Tiferet Israel, helped to build the first Jewish community center in East San Diego, was very, very involved in all this. The Watts building, one of the first major skyscraper buildings he bought in the early 40s, and was just very prominent in this way in the business. Now there's some other headlines about Isidore Teacher, okay? In the 30s, he was able to get out of some stolen property concerns with his businesses. There was some cases of gunshots fired during robberies and all kinds of interesting things. In 1943, the War Department came after him for misusing some War Department housing money. He was a big pusher for taverns. And in 1952, he actually was convicted of tax fraud. And in 1952, the IRS said he owed $232,000. That's 1952 money to the IRS, to give you an example of the scale of this guy's business and his little issue there. There was a very public and open divorce in 1947 in which not only did he separate from his first wife, Betty, but he also had to sue his daughter, Tamara, over stock deals and business properties, and they eventually settled it all out. But it was quite, shall we say, the other side of the headlines to all of the good work in building community centers and being a business leader. And he did, luckily, as a strong supporter of the Republican Party, as President Eisenhower went out of office in 60, pardoned Teacher. He had spent 7 months in jail before being paroled. But anyway, so, okay. A different story a little bit to the general, but what I want to tell you about that is because I also had trouble finding any documentation on this house. The one thing I did find, shockingly enough, was a mechanics lien that maybe meant to put on Teacher to pay off the last parts of the fees, which confirmed in they were documented as the builders. We also got some other interesting things about this house, and it is a house that I would tell you just exudes Rat Pack, Palm Springs ethic of modernist. It was completed. The first permits were in 56. There was some concern with the second wife, Libby, in early 58 over a divorce that ended up not happening. That got me a lot of good documentation on properties going back and forth and reconciliation orders. Anyway, but the house was clearly recognized as a really impressive contemporary modern example. It was on a holiday home tour shortly after it was completed. It was completed, we think, in summer of 58. Held fundraiser events, lectures, all kinds of interesting things. Really, clearly a house for entertaining. And when you'll see it, and when you visit on the tour, you'll see it's a house that was built to entertain folks. It used to have actually an even larger formal gardens. A later owner sold off part of that property, but really was known as a showplace for somebody of Teacher's status, we'll say. And what we also got, though, was an interesting story. A couple of owners ago got a chance to get hold of Dick Mabey on the phone, it's probably about 20 years ago or so, and ask him, hey, so who designed this house? To which Mabey told him, us. There was no architect. But we did use this designer guy. I think his name is Gerald Jerome. And as I was trying to say, Gerald Jerome, when I put his name into the Union Engines, I get like 800 hits. And one of the reasons I get 800 hits is because his neighbor across the street in La Jolla was a guy named Neil Morgan. And Neil just loved to ask Jerry, tell me about your rich, crazy clients and what did they ask you today? And there's just hundreds of quotes of little things like, purple is out at the moment for the courthouse, or don't decorate my house, but don't make it drop dead, whatever, just weird stuff that would come. And he had clients all over it's not only San Diego, but all over the US, especially the West Coast, but also New York and other places. He was in demand. He was and he's another one of these guys who is a World War II vet, comes out looking for a new career, ends up taking classes at San Diego State in design with Il Sirocco and John Dirks and the team, right? And sort of gets into it, opens up his company as things are taking off, and just becomes this go-to, person for every level of design that you can think of. And so, I mean, when we look at who he worked with, and this is just, once again, just the stuff I quick glancing pull from the newspaper hits and some of the projects, everything from the Anthony's Fish Grotto down on the down on the wharf, right? The Islandia Hotel penthouse, the Dorman House in Ramon. I mean, he actually was hired originally for part of the Disney team to work on their Mineral King resort that they never ended up building near Sequoia, to do all the design for that on the interior decorating, right? So that's the level he was working with. Movie theaters, commercial retailers, had his own company for furniture company for a while, the Forum, that a lot of cutting edge folks worked with and profited from. So just a fascinating individual. And of course, his connections, and I just want to show a few things. That was his house in La Jolla that he later sold to the Morgans when they moved to Mission Hills. But everything from statuary, screens, architecture details. And one of the guys that he ended up using a lot early in his career was a guy named Dillard Harwell. And it just happened that that's because Dillard Harwell wasn't only just a co-student there at San Diego State, but Jerry was married to Dillard's sister, Jacqueline. So my family, it's a very close group here, right? And so they all sort of worked, and Dillard was an expert in architectural detailing and sculpture and design, and was part of these things. And as we heard from our good friend who's in the audience today, Jolene, that's Dillard's wife. Hi, Jolene, how are you? That at one point when Dillard and Jolene was looking at a house, and they would drive down Friday, and Dillard reminded her that, I worked on some really nice house around here somewhere. It was pretty cool. I can't remember, just one of the hundreds we worked on, kind of thing, right? Well, guess what? That's this house. This is a Dillard teacher house. And I'll just tell you that, and both those owners, Michael and Barry from a couple, and our current owners, Michael and Matthew, who are sitting right next to me right now, just an amazing home. And I just keep waiting for, Dean Martin to walk out with a martini in his hand or something at this house. And, a round powder room, the built-in bar, the pool, the decor, the inlays, the details, the sunken living room, all things, interior, atriums. I'm just going to tell you this, and it's just beautifully restored and kept, and it's just a gem of a house. And you will recognize very clearly, while someone of teacher's status would have wanted a house like this. And he and his second wife hung on for a few more years, and he got rid of her in 62 or 63, and he got the third wife. But anyway, and he's a fascinating guy. And you may have heard more about his daughter than him in the past, if you're familiar with San Diego history. His daughter was married to a very prominent Jewish doctor named Stephen Rand. And in 1985, Tamara Rand was murdered in her Mission Hills home, execution style. And the story goes that she had been investing with a Del Mar person who had major interests in casinos in Las Vegas. That murder would go about 10 years before it would be solved. It was very challenging for a lot of people how could this have happened to a prominent person? And finally, about 10 years after, with enough of the good fellows involved gone, the informants actually fessed up and said, we know who did it, and were able to solve it. But they had to wait until certain guys were gone before they made those statements, I guess, to the FBI. And if you've ever watched the movie Casino, apparently both Green and Tamarand are models of some of the characters in that movie from their involvement. So anyway, so the other side of, see, we get into local history in a lot of different angles here on the home tour, but just look at this house. I mean, you will have an amazing experience. Don't want to miss this place, right? And of course, one of the guys who worked with Gerald Jerome a lot was Richard George Wheeler, another very prolific architect. Got his start really rolling. He was son of the noted architect William Henry Wheeler, who'd been practicing in San Diego since 1910 or so, 1912, and very prominent. You can see he did just about everything: residences, tract houses, commercial, shopping centers, name it. And was very prominent. And he was good friends with Jerome. In fact, the story is that Jerry and Jacqueline got married at Richard's house. Is that right? Yeah. So very close folks in this community working back and forth on these design projects, right? And so when a Minnesota/San Diego business couple named George and Alice Alvig wanted a home so they could spend their winters here in San Diego and then spend their summers back in Minnesota, they hired Wheeler to build this very nice, very impressive modern house here in the Grossmont area. for them to come out. And they basically, that's what they did during their ownership. They would just come out for the winter, sort of snowbird style, and stay here and then go back. So they didn't do a lot to the house, didn't change it too much or anything. But anyway, this house. And it just happens that a few years later, Dillard, Harwell, and Jolene are going around looking for and ended up purchasing this house. At the time, you guys didn't realize it was Wheeler, right? They hadn't even done the house. There was nothing in the house to explain any of that. But they figured out that it was Wheeler, who was also, Dillard had worked with quite a bit. And of course, Dillard, once again, San Diego State, influences by all those folks. For a while, worked for Gerald, then broke out on his own, had his own furniture design company for many years, continued to do upgrades, and his expertise really in architectural detailing. And you'll see some of this because once they bought this house, Dillard and Jolene started doing some updates to it. And you can certainly see sort of the standard sort of wonderful mid-century sort of elements that you would see in that, as well as that front door, which is one of Dillard's work, as well as the light fixtures, those wrought iron light fixtures next to the beds that are classic Dillard Harwell. And you'll get to experience that as well as a lot of other wonderful decor in the Alvig Harwell house here, right? Okay. Now, I'm just going to do a little brief on this so I can set up Keith for his talk. But of course, the last house we have on tour was designed by, and I think it's probably an understatement, master architect, Sim Bruce Richards. Possibly one of the most talented and unique and inspiring architects in his work here in San Diego County and beyond. And of course, what kind of folks would be hiring somebody like Sim Bruce Richards? Well, attorney Paul Engstrom was extremely well known. I think he was the attorney for the Helix Water District, all kinds of other major firms, and right. And his wife, who happened to be a concert pianist, Parthy, right? And so they needed a house, not only the status with all the good style and everything, but they also needed to make sure it worked out with the music. And you'll hear a little bit about that. And in fact, architectural historian Esther McCoy considered it one of Sim's better works, and you're going to hear all about that. And the house, as Mrs. Engstrom said, really sounded good, as well as looked good. So, all right. So, and it has a lot of other details. And so this is what we're going to focus on with Keith's talk, is to try to give you the breadth and the understanding of Sim Bruce Richards and the role of this house and why it's going to be such a treat for you to get a chance to see it. So there's a couple little preview shots for you, right? And I had a little help from Jim Hubble on this one, as well as Harry Wimmer. So you're going to hear all about that. So this is it. This is it. We're getting ready to set up. You ready to roll? Well, thanks, everybody. If you don't have your tickets, get them. All right.
We want to do a stretch.
Yeah.
I've been sitting for about an hour, loosen up the bones. How's everybody doing? I'm Keith. A couple things just about me. I just Thursday afternoon got my house designated. I'm in the city of San Diego, but it is Bruce Richards' third house for himself. So plaque forthcoming. My wife and daughter and I are very excited. It is just one more part of this longer project of rekindling the spirit and communicating the value and sharing with you all and others, an architect and a person really that I'm very, very, very fond of. I continue to learn a lot about this gentleman. As I've explained to his family who are close to me, it is very odd to try to reawaken the story of someone that you've never met. I've heard his voice. I do have a recording of his voice. I have lots of photographs of him. His widow and his children have shared many, many stories with me. But I'm attempting to tell a story of someone that is not able to be interviewed. And so in that space, I continue to find new details. I published a book about him. Our house has been on tours. I've given versions of this lecture before. I've got another one with Mark at the Athenaeum in a handful of weeks. By then, I mean this sincerely, in 4 weeks' time, I will have learned one or two more things about this gentleman. That said, Jim's invitation for me to be in front of you today is because I will be a docent at the Engstrand House. And for those of you that are going to come to the house, today is just a little priming for what you hopefully will ask me and certainly what you'll witness when you're at the house itself. I want to try to rush through some slides and then maybe give you some time to ask a handful of questions, but I want to make sure you all know that I'll be at that house, and I'll be very much looking forward to being at the house. They're friends of mine, the owners, and it is certainly one of his best houses. So this is Bruce and his bicycle and his mom and his sister, and he's bandaged. I don't know if you can see, but there is a bandage going around his skull. He has just come out of surgery as a 12-year-old for a mysterious ailment that basically took his jaw surgically out. So a man at this tender young age who's already on the precipice of sort of being misunderstood, right? When people meet him, he's got a very unusual look. His grandparents are of Cherokee descent, his great-grandparents. And so there's concerns and issues about how he fits in all the way back to when this picture was taken and decades into the future. This is him as a young man driving one of his first automobiles. There's a long connection I won't go into about him and cars, and it's quite hilarious. There's a series of automobiles. He writes about them. And some people that I've interviewed over the years that drove in a car with him were deathly afraid of his driving style. Not to malign him. It's just one of those things when later in life you lose sight in an eye and depth perception goes out the window. So too do many of your passengers. Not to blow this picture up and out of proportion, but it is one of the earliest images where you can see there's very much truncation under his lower lip of less of a jaw structure. As about a 17-year-old in this picture, he's obviously at the latter part of his high school years. He's becoming a young man, and he starts studying weaving. So this is Master Weaver Melanie Murdoch. He's left Oklahoma. He's now in Phoenix, going to the Phoenix Union High School. His mother is a teacher at the local Native American schools, which were properly called the Indian school of the area back then. The reason I show some of these early pictures is most people shorthand say, oh, he was with Frank Lloyd Wright. Okay. He wasn't even with Frank Lloyd Wright 24 months, right? It's not 2 years. And I have become very vocal about people saying, oh, that person studied with Frank Lloyd Wright, as if that's to encompass their entire time on this planet, right? It is a footnote that people like to hang on to. And as I first was introduced to him by his widow as a Frank Lloyd Wright apprentice, I thought, oh, that's the encapsulation of one man's spirit. There's a lot leading up to it and a lot after that fact. So I've been moving away from saying, well, he was with Frank Lloyd Wright, because that's an important fact, but there's so many important facts in any of our lives, right? This is the Motor Hardware Company, which you're like, why am I showing you a picture of this building? It's basically in Little Italy. And this was his first job when he moved to San Diego as a young man. He told this story to many people. He wrote about this story that as Charles Lindbergh was testing the Spirit of St. Louis here, because it was built here in San Diego by Curtiss Ryan Aircraft, the staff of Motor Hardware went on this very roof and waved to him on these test flights as he motored around like Coronado, the Bay, and where the airport is presently. This picture sort of also is one of these draws away from the Frank Lloyd Wright thing, right? This is like his first bike, his first car, his first job, his weaving instructor. This is him all the way to the left at an easel at the University of California, Berkeley, which I had to explain to someone recently is also nicknamed Cal. Like, a lot of people aren't aware of that. He only wrote Cal. He never wrote the words University of California or Berkeley in any of his notes. This is an art class with three of his friends. In the foreground is a guy, Blaine Drake, who he studies with at Taliesin with Frank Lloyd Wright, with his hand in his pocket. They have left the architecture program out of disgust with the Beaux-Arts traditional European tradition, and they take up abstract painting. At this point in his career or life in college, he's teaching his friends how to weave because his expertise with Melanie Murdoch. He is with Frank Lloyd Wright for, as I said, just under 2 years. There's been exaggerations and claims in the press, some of which were proffered by himself, that this time with Wright was more elaborate and even longer lasting. But because the Taliesin folks create and keep such good records, it was like, 20 months, right? So this is him. I've circled it in a little highlighter. If any of you are familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright's grander story, this is a model of what's called Broadacre City. Broadacre City was what was going to be a city of the future, on just like a prairie that he would create from whole cloth. But it became an academic exercise in where people circulate, where they shop, where they get educated, where they live, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this picture is in an outdoor horse stable in Scottsdale before Taliesin West is built. If you've ever been, it's a lovely tour, that's 1950s, right? This is 1930s. This is decades prior to what you go and get to visit. So the Wright clan, and all these people are annotated. They're all Wright scholars and went on to be architects themselves. They're basically outdoors, no sunscreen, in a horse barn. Not as romantic a tale as people often tell. This is one of my earliest discoveries in what was his remnants of his office, which became part of my basement when I purchased my house. Images like this are now held in the archive of UC Santa Barbara, who, if you didn't know, collects California architects' records, drawings, photos, etc. So this is about 1935, 1934, 1935 at Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin. Here's a cluster of photos I discovered, which the family wasn't even aware of at the time, of him at Falling Water. So Falling Water is 1920s. This Frank Lloyd Wright, as they toured the country, they obviously traveled between Spring Green and Scottsdale twice per year. They would visit some of Wright's projects along the way. This was at some point some side venture where Bruce is photographed as a tourist, right, as a visitor to Wright's Falling Water. After he leaves Wright, he does not know what to do. He does not have a college degree because he left senior year before he earned his degree from Cal. Taliesin does not give any certificates. They don't offer a diploma in architecture. You could get a letter from Wright that says, yes, Bruce Richards was here, but that's it. This is the late 30s. If you know your U.S. history at all, this is a very rough time for everyone, right? At all strata of the socioeconomic ladder. So this is a project that he does the furniture. It's very simple furniture. It's very rectilinear. It's very connected to the work that would be published by people like Rudolf Schindler in Los Angeles. And it's a commission. Large part, he had to work through the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, in the late 30s to get some of his work, some income while he lived with his parents, his mom, in Scottsdale. This is a mural project also funded in part by the Arizona Teachers College and the WPA and some generous supporters of his. Martha Graham, the famous choreographer, is wearing the hat in the middle. I believe the woman immediately to his right is a school administrator, and I'm not sure who the other person is. It's unfortunately gone. We have a small cluster of photographs that detail this, but if you just take this in for a moment before we get to architecture, right? This is where he was headed in the 30s and early 40s. He was going to be a painter. He was going to be a weaver. There is not a lick of architecture other than his time with Wright. He's not pursuing architecture as a career. Furniture making is definitely something he's considering. This is an early work on paper that typifies the work that he did in Phoenix at his first one-man show in the early 1940s. If you just glance at it and you know a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright, you might say it's derivative of what he was obviously taking in while with Wright and the immediate months after he departed Taliesin. towards the 1939 World's Fair, he starts looking at these relief sculptural works, some of which can be made as like a woodblock print, right? You could actually put ink on these things with a roller and make prints from them. He does this this etched glass project, which is part of a fellowship application towards displaying them at the 1939 World's Fair. Where these glasses are is a great mystery. I'm sure they're long gone and broken, but they exemplify a little bit of a mystery for me, a tangent of his artistic endeavors. He gets to San Diego. I am literally going quickly through his life. Both these houses are about 1942. The upper one is in Point Loma. The lower one is in Phoenix. These are the first projects he does as an unlicensed architect that we've been able to actually find photos of, which is another part of drawing a chronology of a man's work and life around projects. They're very traditional looking. You might suggest that the house you're going to see on the home tour looks nothing like this, but this is where his work starts. Quickly, he gets to this crazy, wonderful package on Camino de la Costa in La Jolla. It is still there. It has been remodeled. It doesn't look quite like this anymore, but going from this traditional mode to what supposedly, and Bruce told this story frequently, there were lots of fender benders in front of this house because as people were steering, they were trying to understand what the heck this thing was. Is it a house? It almost looks like a sacred building, but he laughed and joked in his office as people would come to visit that this house caused a lot of car accidents, minor car accidents. His first house for himself with a butterfly roof, he starts articulating these wildly different geometric and very contemporary of their moment designs. The Torrey pine in the front yard, hand planted by Janet, his wife at the time, is got to be 100 feet tall now, and the trunk is much of this seating area. Wow, it's just an amazing tree. This is a house which I've grown more and more fond of this picture because it's a recent discovery of mine. I finally found the archive of the photographer, and I've been spending my alternate Saturdays that I'm not in front of you up there in Orange County going through more and more of these photos. This is the Guy Pito residence in Vista. Footnote to today's lecture, but typifies how quickly he went from traditional to very contemporary styling. He invested himself in lighting. This little square, is there a laser pointer on this baby? Oh, well. The square above the address numbers is an outdoor wall sconce. So there's just a single light bulb in there. It's open air. It's not very fancy. It's the same material as the board and batten exterior, which for him was usually cedar. You'll see another one in the upper right corner with just like a little bit of a lip on it. So there are variations of this. He does interior lighting. So this sort of floating horizontal band separating the kitchen to the living area has these light fixtures embedded in them. I laugh to myself sometimes when people come to visit my house. My kitchen is somewhat oriented like this. People are like, whoa, this is like a open concept, whatever. And I'm like, okay, it's not open concept, right? It's how houses were designed. There's no need for your adjectives, right? It's how he built kitchens so people could speak to one another while visiting and while preparing a meal. It's also very important to look at this kitchen as very good use of space. This is a man that suffered through Prohibition. Applause. Suffered through the Great Depression and harnessed this early experience in his life to make sure that every square inch of his projects were utilized fairly and well appointed. So a lot of his kitchens end up opening up to the living rooms as we like today, but they were very forward thinking back then. This is a fixture, one of many he designed that would be over a dining table. So you see the replication of these little sconces, these little squares that shine light down at the dining room table. This is another variation of lighting I've never seen elsewhere, but this photo. So I continue to go, wow, I wonder why he strayed from his normal lighting scheme for this one kitchen. Again, another example. There's lots and lots of examples of these kitchens that are open to the living and dining area. His own houses always were open to the living and dining areas. We're not going to see it in the same way, but one of his other trademarks, hallmarks of his design is incorporating deck railing with benches. A lot of people like, I think I have a Bruce Richards house. I can say a few things. Do you have that wall sconce? Do you have some interesting lighting? Do you have this patio bench? There's a house being restored in La Jolla right now. I have a photo of their patio bench, but somebody removed it. So we are actually kind of reverse engineering the idea and the notion of having this patio seating. He had really cool garage doors. I'm a very big fan of cool garage doors. You might not see that if you see me on the sidewalk. I am a big fan of cool garage doors. This is, I could go long on this, but I won't. You can see kind of the car in there because it's a translucent material made by Alcinite, a Pacific Beach company. For most of you, you would look at it and think it's fiberglass, right? It's sort of a resin composite plastic material. Very short-lived, but I'm always fond of it because it was a San Diego company that he utilized. In the evening, if you turn the garage door light on, the whole garage door is a Japanese lantern, right? And he called these his Shinto garage doors. He would create these acknowledgments, these terms that were not used everywhere else because in Japan, Shinto does not have anything to do with the garage door. Another example, this is the Alice Clark house in Point Loma. Many of these garage doors have been unfortunately removed in favor of those sort of galvanized tin Home Depot supplier garage doors that kind of roll up, which, whatever, it's not me to be critical. It's just, I am so fond of the patterns. They're all different, right? That's one thing about Bruce. He never did two houses exactly the same. So there are no two garage doors exactly alike as well. Just another variation of these interesting patterns. In the daytime, again, they're less monolithic. They're less sort of opaque and uninteresting as garage doors can be. And in the evening, they present an opportunity for the neighbor to be like, oh, that's kind of like a big nightlight to the neighborhood. Fireplaces, well before me, there were other people interested in documenting Bruce's life and his work. They all, especially the Union Tribune and a lot of the press he garnered during his life, remarked on his unique fireplaces. The funny part about my sort of academic pursuit in understanding his work is while there are no two alike, there's a whole bunch of them that are very similar to one another. So not every brick is in the same position, but there are some themes. One of the themes are these sort of arches. I found several that have this sort of expanded arch. There are several that have Rhoda Lopez's sculptural reliefs connected to them. So in this one, the relief actually wraps and turns into the firebox. They are thankfully well-fired ceramics, and they do survive that heat, and these are still intact. Again, another variation on that sort of arch. Jim Hubble, which I'll get to in 1 second, did the lighting and the stained glass you'll see in here. There's a lot of connections between the artist Jim Hubble, who we also lost earlier this calendar year, sadly. But there's another lecture about his connections with Hubble. And there's outdoor and indoor works by Hubble. When you come to the Engstrand house on the tour, I will be able to point out a really, really unique partnership between him and Hubble on that house, which I'll have some photos of shortly. Sometimes Jim would be hired to do structural componentry. So in this case is the Lion House in Escondido. These two grand columns in the living dining area actually serve as support to the roof. They aren't just decorative elements. And then I'm gonna shift gears for one moment. Is now that I've sort of introduced Bruce, I want to talk about the surrounding context of the house we're going to see on the home tour. So I'm going to show you a couple things in the college area, Spring Valley, and then La Mesa, and then we'll be done, right? You can go home and whatever, ask me questions. One of the fun parts about writing the book and learning about one man's life is he kept referring to an early, he himself in interviews and his own sort of autobiographical notes, kept commenting on this one draftsman he had, this one draftsman named Kirk Breedlove. And so Kirk unfortunately died in an accident early on while he was a draftsman with Bruce. And Bruce just couldn't get over it, right? He really, really lamented the loss of this young man's life. So if you're all familiar with Trinity Presbyterian, which is now just Trinity Church at the top, A-frame on top of Spring Valley, this was supposedly, here's photographic evidence, right? It was supposedly built, and it was a collaboration between the ceramist Rhoda Lopez, who I showed you the firebox sculpture, Jim Hubble of San Isabel, California, and Bruce as a testament to this young man's promise. It was very interesting. It was an outdoor meditation chapel. And everyone said it was in Lemon Grove. For decades, I feel like people have said, oh, it's in Lemon Grove. There's annotations, Lemon Grove. There's annotations on photographs, say Lemon Grove. And I don't know when Lemon Grove and Spring Valley subdivided or became one entity or two. I'm not sure. But I was assured by someone verbally that it was in the backyard of Trinity's grounds. Never trespassing, making appointments, going there during publicly visible hours. I walked the entire acreage, right? Never could find it. And it was really like, it was just a puzzle because I had photographic evidence. It was there. So just recently, after I finished the book, which is always what happens, right? You discover something after the ink is dry, is I finally got someone on the phone at Trinity, and she's like, you know, Keith, I feel your pain. I want to help you out, but none of us were here back then, right? So she found an elder congregant who remembered it and remembered why they demolished it. And I said, well, it's too late to pull back time, and I can't say anything, but we could grieve the absence of this really, really cool space. But I said, why? Why on earth would you demolish such a pretty, interesting, unique space? And she said it was those damn teenagers. Damn teenagers nearby, every evening after the congregants left and the pastor left and went home, they'd drink beer and smoke those damn cigarettes and cavort and make noise. And I said, well, that's interesting. I hadn't ever heard this. And what happened was in the 70s, that church stood on that hilltop by itself, right? And as the land was developed, houses got closer and closer to this very open air chapel. So at some point, the teenagers who had probably been doing this for years, they were now being audibly witnessed by the neighboring houses. And those neighbors complained to the church, put a fence around it, do something about the damn teenagers. I have a teenager, and I am not trying to slight teenagers. But it was one of those sort of, like moments you just grieve and go, wow, it's gone, right? It's gone. But I have some great photographs in partnership with the Hubble Foundation, the Elon Lail Foundation. We've been able to sort of piece together some of what it looked like. And so that was sort of to the east of La Mesa. This is sort of to the west of La Mesa with the Alpha Phi sorority near San Diego State. I do like to remark on San Diego State College because it doesn't change to university till like 74. So there's a lot of great buildings that were devised and built for San Diego State College when it was much smaller. And then obviously the exponential growth in recent years since it became the university. This was nicknamed the Romeo and Juliet balcony. The premise was that Juliet, the sorority women, would be on this balcony and their boyfriends or gentlemen callers would be looking up to them with poetry or something. One of my favorite parts about the photo, if you look closely, the photographer is reflected in the mirror or the reflection of the glass. I don't know who that photographer is. Part of me believes it's actually Bruce himself. If you've driven by, if you're on Montezuma and College Avenue and you're driving east away from College Avenue down Montezuma, you can't not see this building, right? The only unfortunate piece of the story that I have for you is it was stained redwood, as you can see, or cedar, as you can see here, for decade upon decade upon decade. While I was living about 8-10 blocks away from it, one day while driving my daughter to preschool, I witnessed them painting it. And while most people drive by, it's still gray, right? Most people don't remark on that, but it's antithetical to everything that Bruce promoted. He hated paint. I've never witnessed anybody write or say they're just hatred, like raw hatred for paint. And part of it is that it encapsulates wood. It hermetically seals wood. If there's fungus in there, if there's any moisture, it really exacerbates, speeds up, accelerates the demise of the wood itself. The wood's supposed to breathe. It's supposed to stretch and expand with earthquakes and winter and summer, etc. And so I only grieved for Bruce's ideals of all of his houses are supposed to be stained, not painted. I tell people that. I'm telling you this. Most of you could care less. But when you start getting really, really into it, it's really imperative that the wood looks like wood, right? When you paint a flat surface, whether it's wood or steel, it loses the fact that it was wood, right? Especially if you're just on the sidewalk admiring this crazy Hubble entryway, which is the door, the glass, the brickwork that flanks the front door. There's this wonderful pine tree that hovers over the living space. There's this insanely wonderful banister by Jim. The common area of the sorority is the first floor, and then as you elevate up that stairwell, it's where the young women sleep. Just to the east of us, off of Avocado, is the Bauer residence. Not a lot of photographs, very difficult to photograph the house. So here's a vintage photo. Also, too, remarking on the sort of expansive fireplace. This is actually a hexagonally shaped house. It's called the Hex House by way of nicknames. I'm fond of when houses have nicknames. It's usually, this is the Bauer residence, but they're like, we call it the Hex House. I'm like, why the Hex House? It's short for hexagon. I'm like, hexagon's only 3 syllables. You could have, anyway. So now we're in La Mesa, and I'm speeding up, accelerating towards the house you're going to visit. This is the Polk residence. The Shinto garage door is no longer, but the rest of the house is pretty much intact. The owner, we did invite them to be on the tour, they're unable to join us maybe sometime in the future. Robert Polk and his wife and his family lived in this house. There's an amazing spread in San Diego and Point magazine. Before it was truncated to San Diego magazine, it used to be called San Diego and Point. And they did a very long article, pictorial essay on Bruce's houses across San Diego. So this is 1955. This is earlier than the house you're going to visit next month. Next month? Is it next month? Almost. It's a month after. It's like 6 weeks from now or something. Okay. This is the entry. Again, you're seeing some board and batten, cedar exterior, casement windows. This is very prototypical of Bruce's work. Here's your mini fireplace, right? You're going to see one of my favorite fireplaces on the tour at the Engstrand house. This is sort of a little mini version of it looks a lot like my fireplace. It looks like a number of little fireplaces he did. This is the living room looking away from the fireplace. Again, the kitchen is very much integrated to the living space. There's a lot of times I say things and I wish I hadn't said them, but then the internet keeps them for record for all eternity. I was interviewed about a year or so ago, and I called these mid-century modern cabins or something like that. Again, if this video goes on the internet, it reinforces the fact that I said this. I said it just to sort of give people a tease into what you're going to experience if you have never been to a Bruce Richards house. We all think of, I went to a cabin when I was young. I went on a ski trip, or we were up in Big Bear. We were up in Idlewild. We were in Mammoth Lakes. I know like what in my head a cabin's supposed to evoke. It's just supposed to give you that comfortable woodsy feeling. So I say these things only to sort of bring you to that moment of comfort. They are not cabins. Please do not reiterate that I call them cabins. It was sort of an emotional tug to get people sort of into the spirit of what these houses are like. Some of them have been drywalled and painted white, and people feel that they are too dark in the evening. I find that light bulbs work great, but some people don't agree with me. And this house is still very much in this vein. This is the kitchen. There's some unique cabinet pulls that I find have only found in 2 houses. I'll show you another one in a minute. The way you tactily touched the wood in his houses actually were important to him, which is why he hated paint. He wanted you to feel wood, leave the oils from your fingertips behind. as you open these cabinets. Okay, so let's take a step back for one moment because I'm going to get to a house. This is a commercial building for Dr. Larry Fine. It's an optometry clinic on Fifth Avenue downtown. You can see by this picture, it's a one-story building, which is why it's no longer there. What is on this site now is a very large, tall building. This is a sort of a stray from some of his vernacular and a coming together of his work. It's a board and batten redwood project with Adobe infill, and there's some Moorish and sort of some old Western references here. When I went to it as it was being demolished, the Save Our Heritage organization arranged for a tour of people that wanted to see it in its last weeks. It was astounding that it was so weird. Like, I felt like it was the only building in downtown that could have ever projected to the street or the passerby this sort of old San Diego. It's almost like an old Western building, like a saloon, gun show, shootouts and that kind of horses. And when it was gone, it really changed the fabric of the block of the street because it was a pretty big site. In its absence, you just get contemporary condominium living, which is fine for whatever. But I find when we lose these buildings that sort of articulate an era of yesteryear, we lose a little bit of sort of humanity. I don't want to go long in the tooth, but indoors and outdoors, it's basically his wood vernacular and his Adobe. He did separate projects usually, but this is one of those unique ones where you see all of it stylistically coming together. I guess the optometrist is working with a patient on the right. I'm not quite sure. The reason I'm showing this with you is because the client for this is Dr. Larry Fine. And this is his office, which is imbued with a ton of Jim Hubble structural, lighting, and decorative sculptural work. And the shag carpet's going to come back in a second. So just hold still on your fondness and appreciation as I have with shag carpeting. But I have often shown this photo. I think for 2 decades, I've shown this photo in just sort of awe of, can you imagine just like going to the optometrist where you read the eye chart and they put the thing around your face and they go A or B, 1 or 2, but this is the room you're in. It's just startling that we've lost such an interesting and unique space in favor of, obviously just a contemporary building. It's not my place to denigrate the current building, but the loss of this, right, is just astounding that an optometrist even wanted this to be their office space. So where did Larry Fine live? Where did Dr. Larry Fine? Well, he lived off Fuerte in La Mesa. I'm going to show you just a handful of pictures. We've also reached out to the Fines to have their house on the tour. It's not currently in the cards, right? But the house is probably the most astounding of Bruce's houses. And certainly its presence in La Mesa is confounding that we can't have it on a tour. The Fines are lovely people. I totally understand their position on this year's tour. But when I show you these photos, like, so here's the front door, when the husband and wife, the residents welcome me, this is where they say, "Hi, Keith, come on in." And you're like, "Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful." And this is, as the door is opening, you can see the shag carpeting, you can see the Hubble door, the Hubble glass, right beyond it, that vertical post that's sort of a banister balustrade of as you walk in, has this amazing little pit to it, like a palm of your hand. And it's super soft because everybody that walks in that front door for decades has touched it, right? So the oils of their hands and just the motion of grabbing it has made it softer and shinier than the entire rest of the column. But it's also this cute little place where you might throw your car keys, right? And yet it just sits there as sort of a testament to the decades of people touching it. This is a picture that was by Phil McMillan, the local photographer for the San Diego Union at the time. There was a lovely pictorial after the house was completed. So here you see the chandelier over the dining table. You get a really good sense of that columnar sort of piece by Jim and how much light actually comes into the space. This is just another view of it. Also, as with the earlier picture, there's these columns that are sculpted. They're like, 8 or 10 by 10 square columns. They're really quite massive. as I was in the home a couple of months ago, I wasn't aware of this, but when these sculpted columns arrived on site, they were just laying in the dirt, right? And Dr. Fine and his wife, they came home and they're like, "Oh God, what are those things?" They just didn't read the way, because they're laying, horizontally in the yard, and they're like, "Oh, I think we've made a grave mistake." They were hesitant about what they had done because there was an extra fee, I'm sure, attached to Jim's work. But as soon as they set them up and they were, it was holding up the ceiling, they were in awe of it. Just another fireplace. Rhoda Lopez doing some sculpted ceramic relief around it. Just fun. So Dr. Fine office, Dr. Fine house here in La Mesa. This is the primary bedroom with some more Rhoda Lopez stuff around the fireplace. All and more shag carpeting. The shag carpeting is really an interesting story. I meant to get to this earlier. So I asked him, the shag carpeting looks like it's brand new. I'll just say that. Right? I'm like, how do you have, after decades, how do you have such pristine shag carpeting? He's like, well, this isn't the same shag carpeting. I've recarpeted several times. And I'm like, wow, that is, and he's an audiophile, right? So the rooms have these very wonderful sounds in the shag carpeting, and the fabric, the furniture, et cetera, help deaden the sound in the room, so his classical music listening can be just perfect. Jim alluded earlier that the Angstrom house had a grand piano in it. Bruce was always designing houses with music in mind. Many of his clients were jazz and classical music players or fans, or had dueling pianos for guests to play when they came over. So when Larry told me about the shag carpeting and the audio connection, I therefore was able to tell him that fits very well with Bruce's work. So here's the house. This is why we're here today. This is the house I've been trying to build some context around. The Angstrom house is amazing. It has lots of Bruce's componentry all on one site. This picture denotes that site planning was extremely important. It goes all the way back to Louis Sullivan. It goes all the way back to Frank Lloyd Wright. There's a long legacy of people that believed in site planning to retain the contour, the trees, the boulders of the site. And there's other people that would have just assumed dynamited it, made it flat, put a house on it, right? Bruce is of the former rather than the latter school of thought. So when you go to the house, you actually walk through boulders to get to the front door. So you experience the scale and presence of these boulders before you even get to the house, which is a remarkable way to enter the house. So here's the entrance scheme, the boulders on your right that you've basically walked through. Here's what became an outdoor kitchen. You see that little cabinetry. You actually can see a large couple of hexagonal windows, plural, right? They are cut by sort of a mullion, vertical mullion separating each pane. But both the large one that faces the entry and the one in the upper loft story are both these grand hexagons, which for those that really are mindful of Frank Lloyd Wright's teachings and his interest in hexagons as a building module, Bruce put hexagons in almost all of his early plans, and the client would get rid of them towards square and rectangular living spaces, right? So there were always attempts by the architect to put the hexagon in place, but few of them actually existed, so that they became often windows and other decorative elements. This is just one of his sort of triangulated outcroppings as you enter the house. The fireplace, which Will and Annie, the owners and their boys, get to experience this as an amazing hearth, right? Not a fireplace, but an actual hearth where you can kind of sit and enjoy. It's right by the dining table. And you'll see this on the right is a lathe turned sculptural post by Jim Hubble. The reason I'm going to remark on that is when you go to visit the house, it fills a void like only this piece of work could ever fill. And I'll show you, it's coming up to the loft space on the right. So it's like a floor and a half tall, and it fits in the space where this fireplace is stacked on the same chimney structure as the lower fireplace I just showed you. So this piece follows sort of the right-hand side of the fireplace opening. Through that opening, which goes all the way to the ceiling, you'll see this interesting structure, which is, well, let me jump ahead real quick. That light fixture, so I'm going to go back so you can just get a glimpse of it right in that opening between the wall, the kind of closet space and the fireplace. You get some good shag carpeting in this photo. I want you to appreciate that. It is no longer with us. I'm sad. So. This is sort of the big photograph of the residence. We're basically the photographer's standing essentially where the piano would be, and you can see that light fixture off in the horizon between those banister and balustrades by Hubble. There's Hubble, the light fixtures, the banisters, the balustrades. There's window openings, the front door, railings. Jim Hubble is very much present in this house. Despite the absence of the shag carpeting, it is definitely one of the best examples of seeing Jim's work in situ, right, in the house itself. Here you're seeing Mrs. Engstrand down. This was a version of this photo was on the cover of San Diego Magazine. And then you're seeing the hexagonal window to your right, which is illuminating the entire entry space and bringing light into that upper loft space. You're going to see more of the house, right? And I hope you get to see me and we can spend some time. I'll be able to walk you around the house. There's two small remodels that I could point out, but you probably wouldn't even notice them on your own because they work well with the house. Bruce was a complex guy. He was a booster of the things he believed in and a detractor of things he did not agree with, paint being one of them. I'm fond of this photo because it shows, I think, what clients witnessed, right? He was not a movie star. He was not a male model. He had a very interesting demeanor. He had a very interesting presence. He had a elfish smile and an elfish laugh that people have remarked on over the years. He was shorter in stature. His face was pockmarked, what most people think is really bad acne. It was a lot of X-ray prescriptions. Doctors prescribed X-rays to help him with his jaw. Ultimately, they were firing X-rays at his eyeballs to get a small cancerous tumor off an eyelid, and it burned his eye, and then he lost his sight in the eye. He got a glass eye, the depth perception thing I mentioned about his driving. This is one of the later photographs of him just kind of enjoying a day, looking at the photographer. And it reminds me of like who I've been trying to understand was a real person and a very, very, as we all are, very, very complex person that we may never really fully understand. But I think through that house, you're gonna probably get as close to understanding as I have, right? That house will encapsulate and teach you all that you need to know about Bruce. This is his final resting spot, right? This is his memorial service. There's a potted plant and an urn, a funerary urn by Rhoda Lopez. One of his rugs is hanging from the altar, and the natural light in abundance coming through the All Souls Episcopal Church glass wall by Jim Hubble. And that's it. I think we have time, but I don't know. I don't know if anybody has a question. There are restrooms if you have to go that way, and there's parking lot if you have to go the other way. Sometimes I know this is a lot, so I've thrown a lot at you. We've thrown a lot at you today. Yes. Yes. Yes, his 3 children are still alive. One's in Germany, one's in Alameda, and one is in Boulder, Colorado. They are the ones that sold me the house that I live in today after their mom, the widow, passed just shy of her 101st birthday in January of 2017. Yes. That's a great question, and this will be on the internet, so I hate to say that out loud, but they're younger than you, older than me. And certainly by the time someone watches this 2 years from now, we will have all aged. Yeah, they were all born, I would say, gosh, I'm trying to remember the years. They are all born in the decade of the 50s, sort of. Yeah. 2 boys and a girl. The girl got the biggest, best bedroom with the best view. Yes. Locally is the only caveat. I know where some are. The best one is in Oceanside by a Walmart. If you're in Oceanside at the Walmart, it's a stone. So it actually, the house, the Chung residence overlooks the Walmart parking lot. And so you can see the house and you just have to kind of go and see the front door, garage door. Most of them have sadly been removed. Yeah. All right. Any other questions, thoughts? Stephen? Question.
Like the last photographs of the black and white vintage, what year were those taken?
Of the Engstrom house, I think it's all right after completion. It's 64. John Wagaman was the professional photographer of those photos. His photos show up a lot in Sunset, in local publications like San Diego Magazine of the era. His granddaughter is still here in San Diego, but there is no such thing that we know of as a sort of a photo archive. So every time I find a John Wagaman print, I put it in a folder, right? I just don't know how many I'll keep discovering over the years. He didn't just shoot architecture. As all the photographers in San Diego at the time, not all of them lived just on architectural photography. They did portraiture, school photos, right, et cetera. So, but yeah, John did those as well as some color photos for the San Diego and Point magazine article. It's a really lovely article. The family that owns the house, when you go to the tour, they have the magazine framed. It's in a little frame. Yes. Yes. So when I mentioned earlier that I keep going up to Orange County it's John Hartley's family's archive. John and his wife passed some years ago. Bruce did a house for them. The daughter owns what is thousands and thousands of slides, prints, positives and negatives. I've been collating and annotating that photo archive mostly to prep it for donation to an institution. He basically took photographs of buildings that don't exist, that were not annotated or published elsewhere beyond his photograph, and they tell the story from San Diego to Santa Barbara. There's projects in Palm Springs. He took pictures of this particular house that when I publish this photo, it will be the only time anyone's ever seen this house. Like, so in his era of photography, he was able to capture things that just don't exist anymore. And some of them are actually by quite well-known patrons and architects. No, John Hartley is not. John Hartley died. Yes, John Hartley died a number of years ago. He lived in Laguna Beach. There might be another John Hartley. That might be it. Potentially, but I only know of the one. Yeah. But I've been annotating, and it's thousands and thousands, thousands of images. And Mark, you'll be interested in many of those. Yeah. Questions? Oh, all right. Well, it was a pleasure being in front of you for this time. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for your patience. We got a little late start, but we wrapped it up. And if you aren't a docent already or something, get those home tour tickets. We're hoping to match La Jolla and sell out. We're getting there. So get those tickets.